That looks okay to me.
Yeah, okay, let's do that and try
I'm
that
gonna,
one.
let me make you bigger. Yeah, that looks fine.
Okay, so that's good.
I still look murky as hell because I'm not really
You're in
properly.
the situation room downstairs, and so I've broken through the barriers.
That gives a little more light.
Yeah, that's fine. It's fine.
Because the only light in here is overhead,
Overhead.
and I find if I turn it up too much, then it kind of shines down
Yeah. No,
this way. So
if the audio's good, that's what we ultimately are concerned about.
yeah, really, the video is just a
It's just a added
sidebar.
thing we might, use or whatever. So,
Yeah.
all right. So, let me just. Okay. All right. So you generally ready to go? And we are testing. Yes, we are rolling here. Okay. So we're going to do an intro separately. And so we're just going to get into it here. All right. In 3. And so it's my pleasure to welcome to the Speaking of Media podcast, Mr. Bob Reid from Toronto, Ontario. Bob, really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and speak with us tonight. You're another in a line of guests that we've had on and we're going to have on that I like to always say, have been on both sides of the media microphone and really are going to appreciate some of the knowledge and savvy that you're going to hopefully share with us on the show.
Now, Keith, the first rule of communications is managing expectations. So don't set that bar too high, my friend.
Well, as I have explained to you, and as our listeners know, this show is really geared most directly to communicators, mostly in a corporate setting, and in a more direct way, spokespeople, people who are assigned the task of representing organizations, be it companies or other groups. And you've had all kinds of experience on that. Maybe you can just give us a little bit of a sense of, despite my intro, a little bit of a sense of how you ended up where you're currently at with regards to your communications career.
Sure. My resume is fairly simple in that it's got 3 rather large chapters to it. The first began in media. You and I, of course, met at the Ryerson School of Journalism way back when.
That's right.
And having managed to garner a degree from that institution, I set out into the world of broadcast journalism in radio. My first job was with a national radio news service called News Radio. And it was really broadcast news's chief competitor at the time. And so my first job in media was writing copy, intro copy to either voice reports or actualities, sound bites, and writing the scripts around those, packaging them all up, and then sending them out by satellite, which was pretty cool, to radio stations across Canada. So I started as a news writer and editor, and worked my way up to becoming a reporter and newscaster. And that was my life in radio in different incarnations. General assignment reporter, Queen's Park bureau chief. I was the bureau, but never let the fine print get in the way for the news radio service. So I had radio stations across Ontario and across Canada taking my reports from Queen's Park from the Ontario legislature. And so that was an excellent start into a broader communications career. I made the change, crossed the floor, as it were, from being a member of the Queen's Park Press Gallery into working in politics and government at Queen's Park, at the Ontario legislature. I started with the leader of the third party, who in those days was a relative unknown named Mike Harris. And he went on to become Premier of Ontario, elected in 1995, re-elected in 99. So I was initially his deputy press secretary, then senior media advisor throughout most of his time as Premier of Ontario. And as I say, as in opposition before that. And that was a big transition for me because I switched sides of the microphone. I went from being the guy asking the questions to the guy who was prepping the guy who would have to answer the questions. And not just the premier, other members of cabinet, other members of caucus, all the way down the line. I had involvement and responsibility in that. And then after almost 10 years of that, I made the shift to the agency world with Veritas Communications. I've been with the same single agency since I left government way back when. And I've never been the guy with the 5-year plan. I've always just kind of rolled with where I am and is it working, and is it still challenging, and is it still engaging? Is it still fun? And am I still learning things? And as long as the answer to all of those is yes, I tend to stay put. So that's why I say that there hasn't been a lot of different columns in my resume. But to your point, I think it's set me up well for having a pretty good grounding in communications and media from both sides of it.
Right. And that's why I'm really excited to have you on the show. I mean, I feel like political communications, trying to get messages out there, trying to influence people, certainly through the pandemic period, that's been front and center with a lot more day-to-day communications going on. And we can talk about that in a little while. But for those of us who are tuning into the show who, perhaps work outside the political realm, but are in a situation where they are responsible for communications, I always feel like getting it from somebody who's had to deal with it in politics is so valuable, because basically you're on the hook each and every day, each and every hour of every day, to be responsible for the public trust, frankly. And you just get a lot more practice at it. Whether or not you actually are being asked on a daily basis, depending upon who or what you're working with, you need to be prepared to be speaking to the media every day. And a normal day in the life of a political communications person is probably a high-end issue to crisis for most people who don't run into having to deal with large issues on a regular basis. So what would you say to our audience, Bob, in terms of, from a very sort of 40,000 foot view, what have you found over the years has made people effective in dealing with tricky issues or crises? What's the thing that what's the thread maybe that rolls through from a skills point of view that helps communicators the most?
A couple of things come to mind. The first is grace under pressure. You really need to be able to deal with unexpected things and pretty dramatic things, depending on the nature of the work that you're in and the kinds of scenarios and issues that you need to manage as a communicator. Obviously, in government, it's very high, it's very adversarial. As you well know, the political reporters who cover whether it's the legislature or City Hall or Parliament Hill, their first question, actually, whatever number question, is never, tell us all the wonderful things you've been doing on behalf of the people lately. It's a confrontation of, here's a problem. What are you doing about this? How are you going to solve that? What's wrong with this? Why isn't this working properly? So it's always very, very much defensive. Yeah. That's a hyper exaggerated scenario for most folks out there. In the corporate world, in public sector, in pretty much any other incarnation, you're not going to be challenged as hard. Although that said, if there is an issue that your organization bears responsibility for, and particularly if people have been harmed by it, whether that's personally or physically, God forbid, it can be a really terrible situation to be in and highly, highly challenging. So that's why I say grace under pressure is essential. First of all, you have to be one of those people who can keep their wits when all about you are losing theirs, and to keep things in perspective while you're trying to manage the situation. You have to be nimble. You have to move quickly in crisis situations or a hot issue situation. You need to be able to gather information quickly, process it quickly, and then work with that information to inform your communications. What are the important messages that you need to get out to the different audiences who may be listening, people who are directly affected, stakeholders, customers, clients. There can be a tremendous range of different audiences and audience segments that you need to meet. And again, you need to work quickly to identify, okay, who is it we need to speak to? What is it they need to hear from us right now? And how quickly can we get that information out? Another key element is perspective. Being able to, first of all, have perspective about your organization's place in the world, and perspective in terms of how the situation at hand is impacting on people. Because ultimately that's what it comes down to. How does this affect people? How is this affecting people? And what steps are being taken to address it if things have gone wrong, to make them right? If something needs fixing, how is that going to get fixed? If there's a problem that needs to be solved, how is that going to solved? How is that going to get solved? So a number of different dimensions all come together in issue management when things really are on a hard boil.
Yeah, and I think that those attributes or traits, I would say, go hand in hand, if not directly in hand with being prepared and having plans. And we talk a lot about that in crisis communication and preparation. You can probably guess at a good 80% of the bad things that are going to happen to you. Crisis often happens into that 20% area where it's a little bit more unexpected. But that said, keeping your wits, I think, is a great point, because I think even well planned, even anticipated, when you know it's hitting the fan and the phone starts ringing, you actually know it's a crisis by the amount of perspiration that you find on the hand picking up the phone, I think, in many situations. Right?
You just touched on another important aspect of good communications preparedness, and that's planning. And that is the wargaming exercise that every organization needs to do before anything goes wrong. And that means taking stock of your organization, your operation, whatever business you're in, whatever service you provide, whatever the focus of the business's work is. What could go wrong? What has gone wrong in the past, either with this organization or others in the same field? What are the kinds of things that on the worst day might happen? And identifying those things, building scenarios where those things might happen, and then having a plan in place, a crisis management and emergency management plan, so that when, God forbid, something like that happens, you're not starting from scratch. You're not going, oh my God, what do we do? Who do we need to call? Who do we need to pull into a room together? Whose responsibility is this? Those are the kinds of steps that you need to have planned out ahead of time when it's smooth sailing, so that if you have to, break the glass and sound the alarm, then everybody knows what their assigned roles are. So who is your crisis management team? Who are the ones who are going to begin the work of developing the responses and the messages? Who are the spokespeople who are going to carry those messages forward? Before you get to that point, who are the approvers who are going to have to sign off on it? Do you need your legal counsel? In a lot of cases, if there's a legal department in an organization, they want to have sign off on things. A board of directors might. Certainly a senior management team is going to have to sign off on the work that's done before actual execution happens. So it's imperative that everybody knows their responsibilities all the way down when the alarm goes off.
Being in that situation, I can totally agree with that. I also can push back on that a little bit, and I know that I get this pushed my way in terms of sort of a devil's advocate perspective. Having a plan that is been drafted, perhaps by former employees, a former regime, if you're changing people all the time, having those sit on the shelf, and suddenly not having gone through the scenarios or worked through what's going on can really be a detriment. There is some thought around at least having people understand the process if you've got to go to the book for specifics around what you've agreed to or what might be pre-approved, that you don't have to worry about in a crisis situation. But can you just sort of, offer your value on scenarios and having it in people's minds? I think the other thing is identifying and everybody being on the same page that you actually are in a crisis. Sometimes that's not a commonly held thought. And for everybody to understand that you have kind of flipped the switch and we are into a crisis mode. I often think that it's like, at the tennis club, we've got the defibrillator, and it's nice to have that there as a sort of a backup. But only so many people at the club know how to use it, and who is actually going to pull that thing off the wall? What's going to be the determinant for that to kind of spark a reaction? Who's willing to rip a shirt off somebody to put that on? Is that really what needs to happen? And that comes with a little bit more of a depth of understanding, like you say, perspective. I love that. Being able to give context to what's going on and really, being confident about acting on big issues or problems as they arise.
You can't plan for every contingency. You can't plan for all of the unknowns. That's a fact that everybody has to acknowledge and understand. But there are a lot of things that you can plan for. And there are a lot of decision points that are fairly black and white, or should be, in terms of that gradient scale. As you say, when do you pull the defib off the wall and open somebody's shirt up? You need to have those established ahead of time so that there's no doubt about it, that we've got to move quickly, and now is the time to take that step. I know that's easy to say on the one hand, but it's also one of those things. It's amazing how many organizations don't give enough credence to that and don't give enough forward planning to it. And the other thing about your defibrillator example is, if whoever's pulling it off the wall also has to start for the first time reading the how-to instructions, the how-to guide, then that hasn't been properly planned out. And if you've got a dusty crisis communications plan or issue management plan sitting on a wall or sitting on a shelf rather, and when something bad happens, you have to start at page 1, then your team's not ready. The first couple of steps, knowing who has to get called into a room together, or who needs to be notified and who needs to be activated, those are the kinds of things that people need to have as walking around knowledge, not, oh, gee, let's pull out the book and start from page 1. And maybe, at some point we'll be able to actually respond to this. So being current on at least the initial steps is critically important, because there's never enough time. There's never enough time to adequately do the perfect job. You got to do the best job you can as quickly as possible. And certainly speed is of the essence, and that's a corresponding scale to the severity of the issue. So, if there's been an injury or a death, you've got to move at light speed, because the phone is going to be ringing. The media are going to be aware. You're going to have to respond to that quickly. If it's a non-physical harm scenario, it could be a data breach. It could be some other kind of confidentiality. It could be employee misconduct in terms of fraudulent activity, or I'm blue skying things here, but there's a range of things that can suddenly put an organization on the hot seat and having to move quickly to be able to take action, respond, and account for their actions.
Is there anything that you see, obviously, if none of those things happen properly or happen well, an organization can get into hot water and end up calling Veritas Communications or someone like yourself. But is there anything that communicators that you see in a routine or typical basis do early on in something like this that makes it worse, that throws proverbial fuel on the fire, that people should be aware of to try to avoid?
Silence. Silence is the worst thing in the midst of a serious incident, serious issue, where there is demand from media or stakeholders or customers. You know, this doesn't always have to be direct to media communication, but to an audience that needs to hear what's happened, what are you doing about it immediately in the short term, and what are you going to do in the longer term to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. That's the holy trinity of crisis communications, right? So silence is your enemy there, because the longer the people who are demanding information don't get it, the greater the likelihood that that vacuum is going to be filled by other things, and the greater the likelihood that your silence will be misinterpreted. Because if you're not saying anything, then it's up to the imagination of the people who aren't hearing from you as to what your silence says, or what that suggests about the way you're operating things. So, you know, back to you, your question was, what are things that take a bad situation and make them worse? That's one of them. Slowness and silence, and the two go hand in hand. Turning that around, thinking of examples of very good crisis communication, they tend to be the ones who move quickly, the ones who are as transparent as possible, and as forthcoming as possible, and as honest as possible. And key to that is being able to say, I don't have that information at this point. We're moving as fast as we can. Here's what we know till now, but here are a number of things that we don't have answers on. We're going to get them, and we're working right now to try and get them. And the next time that we speak, I anticipate having more answers for you. But those who demonstrate engagement, the we get it factor, we know this is a big bad thing, and we're on it. We're taking action. You know, the sleeves are rolled up. We are on the case. That's the first single most important message in any circumstance, demonstrating that you get it, and demonstrating that you're taking this seriously, and you're moving as fast as you can to try and get answers, to try and address the immediate situation and then the longer term situation.
I often talk about getting ahead of the issue when you get into a crisis situation. Defining that sometimes can be a bit of a tricky procedure. How do you, at your organization, characterize getting ahead of an issue, and what are some, ways you can do that, or some examples of how that gets put into action?
Well, the rule of thumb on this kind of thing is it's way better to have one really bad day than a series of not quite as bad days, but the death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing.
Right.
Day after day after day of yet more bad news, of yet more revelations. If you're able to, and you're not always, you aren't necessarily in this position, but if you're able to get all the bad news out in one fell swoop, that's a lot better than, as I say, a steady drumbeat, a drip, drip, drip of revelations that put a fresh top on the story and make it news all over again, day after day after day. It's better to lance that boil at the outset, do it yourself, because if you are the bearer of the bad news, you're also the framer of the bad news, or at least you get to attempt that. If you're responding to it, if others are breaking the next bad development that's come out of it, then you're constantly playing catch up. So, and these are hard decisions to make. One of the natural instincts in any organization, and I've felt it myself, is the self-preservation aspect, that this just looks terrible for us, and I want to try and contain as much as possible and minimize the bad story that's out there. Of course you want to try and do that, and that can be detrimental though, if you're putting yourself or your organization, those interests, ahead of the interests of those who have been wronged or affected or negatively impacted by the issue at hand. That is a critical mistake because it's not about you at this point. It's about them. It's job one has to be acknowledging the needs of those who have been affected, impacted, harmed, and detailing the action that's being taken to address that, not thinking first and foremost of how do we protect our reputation, how do we protect our brand, because if you get that wrong, the damage to your reputation and the damage to your brand is going to be way worse. It's kind of like the crime and the cover up, right? The cover up is always worse, and so if there is any kind of cover up, and I'm using air quotes there, but minimization, not recognizing, not understanding, not doing the right thing in the midst of an urgent issue, that will bite you twice as hard down the road versus, boy, this was a bad thing, but look how transparent they were. Look how honest they were. Look how forthright they were with everybody and in their approach to it.
Yeah. And I want to talk about authenticity, but again, thinking about our listeners on this podcast, even if you get all of that right, sometimes you have to influence people within your organization, specifically your senior leaders, that's the way. And if they don't have that as part of their thinking, that's where delay can happen. That's where internal strife can cause delays and can make for a bad response, basically. And that's what is sort of the end product sometimes of you don't mean to be that way about it, but the realities are, especially as an organization gets larger and larger and there's more and more interests involved, that it can be a difficult thing to pull off. You have to have a certain amount of grace under pressure to deal with your own people as much as sometimes those who you are responding to. I'm sure you see a lot of that in the work that you do once someone comes to you. My question for you is, when do you, and this is maybe a sales pitch opportunity for you, but when do you expect people to come to you when they're in a bad situation, to come to an agency? What typically is the tipping point for an organization to come and seek services outside of their own organization?
It should be right away. I mean, it depends on the organization, of course, and how robust an issues and communications team they might have in-house. But that said, we have regular clients who have all of that infrastructure themselves, but they use us in addition to supplement their team in different areas of expertise that aren't necessarily crisis related. But the fact that they know that we have that capability, even though they have people in place who are very good at managing things, the smart ones call us as well at the first sign of trouble. And they say, here's what's happening. Our team is on it. We wanted to give you the heads up, give you a quick brief, see if you have any top line advice for us or anything that we're maybe not thinking of on our side, so that we can add that into the mix and maybe bring me or my colleagues in on an active basis right at the outset, or to have us on standby for further support as things go. Because sometimes it's like, we think we've got a pretty good handle on this. They just want a gut check. Are we doing the right things? Are we missing anything? Do you have any advice on things that we should be incorporating into the messages that we're putting out to our audiences? So sometimes that can just be the extent of it. Other times it can be, get ready, we may need you to literally be working side by side with us for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, depending on the nature of it. The worst calls are the ones when, we've had 3 days of terrible press because of the way we've handled this thing. Can you make it stop now?
Fix it. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you flip that switch off? No.
I go back to my comment around senior leadership. Sometimes would you be brought in to amplify a voice from a communications corner or unit to senior leaders as sort of a validator that, they need to kind of go in the way that communicators are thinking, or vice versa, perhaps?
That happens a lot. And it always pains me for the in-house folks who have already come to the same conclusion that I have, that have already recommended the best advice, but the boss isn't taking it for some reason, right? What's the old adage of profits never recognized in their own country? Like
Right.
it can be, and it's so unfair. And I always feel for the people when it happens. There can be tremendously bright people who see exactly the right way forward. They've made that recommendation and they get, well, let's get some outside counsel and see what they think. And they'll hear the exact same thing from outside counsel and go, yep, that makes perfect sense. That's why you guys are the professionals. That's why you're the experts in this kind of thing.
Right.
When you can sometimes, as I say, be exactly on the same page as in-house. So look, if that's what it takes to tip it over the top of the hill and make it happen, I'm happy to help do that.
So we talk a lot about this on this show about, not saying anything, the no comment world, and trying to shut down and become, get back into your own shell and not go anywhere. We agree, and we'll keep iterating that that's not the way to go. Now, in the age of social media, we've got some, enthusiastic, inventive, innovative leaders who are wanting to jump in and speak and offer commentary and so on. Again, I think it's a great thing to try to be more authentic, to be more open and obvious to the people that you're serving, whether it's a private or public organization. But I'm sure that there's just as many problems that result from that as there are in not talking about something, and that you can invent your own, again, crisis by sticking your foot in your mouth as much as not saying things. Any war stories about something like that, or what you perceive around that? People who want to do more and say more, but can sometimes be called out or highlighted when there's perhaps another example in the news, and a bad story that's gone wrong in the past keeps getting repeated on a company.
Yeah. Well, there are two extreme ends of the scale, right? There are the CEOs. Let's use that title for what it can be anybody at a senior level, but there are those who are absolutely petrified about ever putting their heads up or saying anything publicly or talking to media or coming up out of the foxhole when things are bad. That's the one end of the spectrum. The other is I'll handle this. I know exactly what to say, or I haven't even consulted with anybody, and I'm on Twitter already responding to it.
Right.
We've seen 4 years recently of how unfettered social media rants from the top or comments or whatever you want to call them can create untold numbers of issues themselves.
Right.
So, but my point is, there are sometimes those who have no hesitation to plunge in themselves from a very senior level and to use the social media tools that let them connect directly with their audience. That can be a very good thing in terms of transparency and responsiveness and authenticity, but it can also be disastrous if it's not done properly and if it's done single-handedly. Because in a crisis situation, there's no one person who has all the answers. There's no one person who can be just pushed out the door and let to their own devices, and they'll handle it perfectly and everything will be fine. Some senior level executives are tremendously strong communicators and are huge assets in dire situations or extreme issue management challenges. But another thing is, you don't necessarily lead with your ace all the time as well. There can be a scale to these things, an escalation scale, and it's not always appropriate to use the CEO or the top official in the company or in the organization right out of the gate. That's a level that you quite often in a lot of situations want to have in your hand to play later if things escalate to that level. And so I'm always fascinated when there is an issue management case at play to look and see who the spokespeople are, what level are they at, And more often than not, initially, it's those in decently senior positions, but uh, who have the specific area of responsibility for the issue at hand. You know, it's entirely their department that is having the problem. They're not the top level executive. They are senior, appropriately senior, but they have that full level of responsibility for that particular area. Those quite often are the initial responders, the initial voices in stories like that. And then later, if need be, you can always escalate it to the CEO, the chair of the board, the whatever the top level is
Yeah.
depending on it.
No, great insights. Absolutely. And I think when you're watching people or organizations that you know to be solid on this, it's all, like you say, it's telling sometimes to see who it is who's out there speaking. And it almost tips their hand in terms of where they expect, if they expect to be more follow-up, to have that room or that luxury, I would say, of deciding if it were to escalate, you could come down with the hammer with a higher ranking person at some point to step in if they think that it's going to go there. So
Yeah,
great
but
insight.
there are those times when the top dog is the only one who can appropriately be out there. That there is no multi-level escalation
Right.
when it's so big, when it's so serious that you need the highest level authority to be the voice and face.
Yep.
And examples that come to mind are, well, look throughout the pandemic. Yeah, we've seen health ministers and medical officers of health, but first and foremost, we've seen the prime minister, we've seen premiers in different provinces, we've seen the mayors of the cities, right?
Right.
They're the ones that we're seeing and hearing from first because they're at the top of the leadership pyramid or diagram,
Right.
and then they'll be supplemented by the others. Or thinking back to one of the greatest recent memory examples, Maple Leaf Foods with the listeria outbreak,
Right.
and the CEO there immediately coming into play and being the one who was fronting the initial response and then the subsequent updates, demonstrating that right from the top of the organization, they were engaged, they were taking it as seriously as possible, they were committing to doing everything they could to try and make things right and to address the serious challenges that were at hand there.
Yeah, we use that Maple Leaf example as a real step forward in terms of the practice there, where Michael McCain, and there's great stories about it. Maybe we'll allude to them at some point in the future, but how he and two other people basically in his office took a simple camera and tried to respond as quickly as they could when they realized the scope of what was going on, and that he basically said he wasn't, he hadn't cleared this with the lawyers, and this is what they were responsible for. And in the end, the opportunity that came out of that was their whole focus turned to food safety, and made that a whole part of their culture moving forward. So anyhow, we'll talk about that some other time, but great examples.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So sometimes there's some internal strife, sometimes there's not. And sometimes everybody really wants to think like they're on the best side of these issues. I want to talk about sort of groupthink and making yourself feel like within the bounds of our walls, we're feeling pretty good about this, and the rest of the world's getting this wrong. I think we're all good with this, and looking around the room and looking for nodding heads, and that can be disastrous in a similar way to throwing gas on the fire as well. But just some thoughts about groupthink.
That's why earlier in this conversation I cited perspective as one of the
Yes,
essential qualities.
Love that. Yeah, detail.
Because if that mindset takes root, and well, this isn't that big a deal, and we've done an amazing job in responding to this, and we've got such a strong track record on this. I don't know why people are even questioning anything. Yeah, that can be highly, highly dangerous. That's also a time when outside counsel is helpful as well. It can be exceptionally valuable to gut check with people outside of your regular walls because they're not immersed in that environment every day. They're not Kool-Aid drinkers, if you will, when it comes to, you know, the corporate line and the internal mindset and all of that kind of stuff that can be very important to an organization's culture and way of thinking and all that. I'm not running it down, but if you're so immersed inside that bubble that you're not accurately seeing how the issue at hand is playing out outside the bubble, then that's a real problem. And that's where outside counsel can be so helpful.
It really wouldn't be a crisis if people weren't thinking badly of you, right? Like, and you have to understand what their perception of you is. It's got to be a part of the mix, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Social media, we kind of touched on this a little bit. And it's like, I'm going to talk like it's just started like a couple of weeks ago, but how has social media really changed the practice of issues management? I often think around, having come from the positions that I've worked in, how it affects news cycle, how it affects perceptions turning into realities, how it can influence or force communicators to overreact. Again, I love the whole idea around perspective and context on things. What's the biggest problem that social media usually brings when a file comes your way?
I love to say that the great thing about social media is it's given anybody with an internet connection the ability to publish or broadcast. The worst thing about social media is it's given anybody with an internet connection, yada, yada, yada. It's very double-edged that way. And it's also double-edged in terms of the advantages that it offers and some of the perils that it brings as well. On the advantage side, it's amazing how in relatively short history, journalistically, we've moved from social media being a brand new thing that wasn't necessarily taken at full face value to now being the equivalent of the press release. And I can think of multiple organizations that they don't do press releases to media anymore. When they have something to announce, they tweet it and they link it back to an announcement on their website, or they do it on their blog, or they do it via Instagram.
Right.
You know, now today we've seen presidential campaigns launched through social media first.
Right.
Mainstream media will report quotes from social media posts, certainly from Twitter and also Instagram and anywhere else, but without even batting an eye, that gets put straight into reporting because it's verified that it's from that source, and this individual who represents this organization made this statement. Boom, it's on the air. It's in the newspaper the next day.
Right.
Whereas, you know, before you used to see attributions like, you know, in an email, so and so said.
Right.
You know, now that's just a direct quote.
Right.
The vehicle has become less and less important, and for communicators, it's an exceptionally handy tool because you can connect with your audience immediately. If you got to get something out there in a hurry, you can do it, and it will get noticed. It will get traction. Right. The flip side of it, the negative side, I guess, is the universe of trolls or whatever you call it, because there is no shortage of haters out there for any brand, for any organization, whether it's specific that people have a hate on for or a vendetta against for some reason, or if it's just the people who like to take shots at anything that moves out there. Right. You're going to get all of those. And again, back to perspective. You know, sometimes we'll get calls from from client organizations who have a social media presence, and they're like, oh, we've got people saying terrible things about us on social media. What do we do? What do we do? This is an emergency. This is red hot. It's like, well, hold on. Who are they? How many of them are there? And do they have any reach? Are the posts that they're making or the tweets or whatever it is, do they have any resonance? Are they sparking any discussion or feeding into any discussion? Or is it just somebody with a handful of followers ranting
Right.
and tagging your brand in it and naming your organization? They're just,
Right.
throwing up the window and yelling and screaming about you.
Yeah.
And so that perspective is important. And that's the first thing that we look at when we get those calls. Like, we think something might be blowing up on social media that could be really bad for us. Well,
Mhm.
first of all, let's get a sense of, as I say, who is it? Do they have any followers? Do people pay attention to them? Are they nobodies? Are they just cranks?
Yep.
Or are they somebody whose word sparks a ton of response comments and forwards and all of that stuff? So
Right.
that's one of the first assessments you got to make as well.
Yeah. I love the whole idea how it's changed the practice, and like you say, you skip the steps around attribution and so on when it comes to up material it's taken from social media, because I think that organizations do go down that road, and a lot of them, like you say, have basically disposed of the news release and are now telling their own stories through their own channels, which is good because there's stakeholders and there's people who are interested in what's going on. I expand that a little bit because I'm wondering if you're seeing, like I'm guessing and have experienced, that not all crises have a particular responsible party, not just a solo or one. Often, if it's a big enough story, there's more than a particular organization that's in the spotlight. And sometimes, the one or two organizations that are maybe in partnership, one's a bit more obvious than others, even though it causes grief or a sense of responsibility for others who are closely connected to an organization that's experiencing a crisis. Would you agree that it's never quite as simple and black and white as it may appear in the newspaper in terms of who's actually sweating over an issue?
Depends on the circumstance. Some issues are very specific to an individual organization and individual people within that individual organization. Others are more sector wide, right? It can be a negative issue situation that is rippling across an entire sector of businesses, for example.
Yep.
And so any business that's in that field could be and probably is having to deal with the negative repercussions of this. And that's a scenario where um, the individual companies within that sector need to make some decisions in terms of do they need to take any ownership for it? Should they? Or do they not have to? Because not every bad story, even if it affects the area that you do business in, is one that you should own or that your brand necessarily has to be connected to. And as a former journalist yourself, you remember these stories, right? There's an issue at play in this area. I've got to find somebody from a company that's part of that sector that can give me perspective that can speak to this story. So what do? You start making calls,
Right.
right? You call Coke, and if Coke doesn't respond, then you call Pepsi, and if they don't respond, then you just go down the list of those companies, those businesses in that category until you can find somebody who will give you what you need for your story. From the communications management standpoint, those are cases where you have the pass or play option. You don't have to be the poster child for your industry
Right.
necessarily.
Yeah.
And if it's a negative story, you probably don't want to be the one putting your hand up saying, yeah, I'll give you an interview and talk about this terrible thing and
Right.
have my company name attached to it, when it's
Yes.
not something that your company owns necessarily. You're just into it by broader association.
It can be a downside of having good close relationships with sector or beat reporters, right? And
Yeah.
so that's not necessarily always a case of you saying no comment, but you can be strategic about how you go about being positioned in a story. And in a very specific way, the most simple approaches to media, who else are you talking to in this story, can be asked of reporters. Trying to get a sense again of context, of scope of what's going on out there, right? And I would say, and I always, in these kinds of situations, I always suggest if it's at all about you and it's a broad enough story, you need to be getting your own story together. Whether or not you're putting your hand up, whether or not you're finding a way to not be the focus, because sometimes in those stories when there could be many people who are involved, the people who speak up, it becomes about them, perhaps unfairly. The other approach there can be, and you can correct me on this, is to be in contact with your partners or the affected responsible parties and have a strategy to go out. There is opportunity in crisis. There can be ways that you are able to demonstrate what's going on, not only to correct perhaps bad perceptions, but to bring a greater focus on what your organization is doing. So this isn't about avoiding media. It's just trying to be strategic about the way that you respond and are represented in stories. So
Yeah, and that example that we were talking about, that's the time when associations can be your best friend. You
yep,
know, industry organizations who speak for the industry writ large,
yep,
so that is the role for those communicators to speak to the broader issue that is bedeviling an entire sector
right,
rather than the individual companies involved necessarily.
yeah,
Assuming again that the the issue is equally spread.
yes,
If it's clearly owned by one player, then that's a different story. But if it's something that's kind of across the sector,
yeah.
then that is the time for an industry association, a trade association, a professional association to be the voice of its members.
It's great. Hey, we're getting great value here, Bob. This is all really great stuff.
Worth every penny you've paid for it, sir.
Well, exactly. But one area that I really want to hear from you on is that of spokesperson, and what communicators need to be thinking about, whether they are the spokesperson or there's someone who is responsible for preparing someone to be out for media or other opportunities to speak on behalf of an organization. Good and bad. What's the up and down side, and what do ultimately, who are the best spokespeople?
The best spokespeople are the ones who understand the role and understand the mission and who understand the importance of message focus, but also have the other side of it, and that's just the talent, I guess, for lack of a better word, to be able to roll with tough or unexpected questions or angles, and to be able to respond to them in a way that uh, returns back to the important messaging that the organization needs to get across, while at the same time truly being responsive and transparent and as forthcoming as possible under the circumstances. Sometimes you'd love to be able to say more, but you just can't for a number of reasons. Other times it's strategically not advantageous to get into great levels of detail. But the best spokespeople are the ones who can credibly represent their organization, deliver the most important messages for the circumstance at hand, and do it in a way that reinforces positively the core brand aspects of that business or of that organization. In the role of communications aid, communications staff, the people who prepare the spokesperson. When I worked for the Premier, I used to say sometimes that on a good day I was in the surprise elimination business. That the best days were days that when he walked out in front of the assembled press gallery and took questions on every issue that was on the boil at the time, regardless of what particular aspect of the government it was in. If everything that came up was something that we had talked about beforehand, that was a good day at the office for me. You always lived in fear of the left fielder that you didn't see coming, not because the premier I worked for or any executive that I've worked with, not that they're not capable of answering questions by themselves or dealing with the unexpected in the moment, not by a long shot, but it's always better if you've had the opportunity to have some discussion ahead of time to frame messages and approaches to an issue at hand. So from a support standpoint, anticipating and helping prepare as much as possible is the single best way that you can support the spokesperson that you are working with, ensuring their comfort level so that they have a very clear sense of what it is they need to get across through that opportunity to the audiences they need to reach. What are the important messages? What are the things they need to watch out for? Are there any real landmines that, if it came up, could potentially make a bad situation worse? And if so, how best to deal with those? You can never anticipate everything, as I've said earlier, but the more you can kind of war game out and prepare a spokesperson so that if they're confronted with something that, if they weren't prepared for it, would make their blood run cold and would be, oh my God, what do I do now? How do I possibly respond to this? If you've been able to fire drill that out beforehand, if this comes up, here's the first place you've got to get to in terms of a response message. Here's the first idea that's imperative that we get out. And then secondly, we need to shift the focus a little bit into this area that is actually positive for us, where we do have some progress to report, where we do have some good things that we can point to and move forward from there. If you've done that construct ahead of time, then when that nasty issue gets raised, when that tough question comes up, the spokesperson's response internally is not, oh my God, what do I do now? It's, we talked about this. Okay, right. Now I know what I'm supposed to do. I know where I'm supposed to take this when I've got the floor.
Right. Yeah, spokespeople responses can really be the front line or the headline of so much other work that's going on behind the scenes that support what they're saying, and being able to demonstrate if they're saying that, they're reacting to something by putting something in place. Having that work going on in the background, usually when these things are going on, is so very important. I know I've often heard from people saying that spokespeople need to have a thick skin. I always believe that the person with the most emotional intelligence was the one that I really wanted to have out there. Someone who could read what the real concern or what the story was that was building in a reporter's mind that they were trying to get at through their questions, and sort of understand that and give back a reassuring or a reasonable response. I always felt like, especially in really high emotional type situations, that those kind of people in front of the camera were the ones that I liked having there. I know that you'll be a proponent of media training, but let's say somebody doesn't get that far and they're thrust into the spotlight. Is there sort of a magic time or some phrase you might put into somebody's head? What's the one thing that a spokesperson really needs to have in their mind before they walk out on stage or in front of those microphones, in your view, to really be successful?
What's your message? What is the important message or messages that you need to get across through this interaction? And connected to that is, who's the audience that you're really trying to speak to? You're not talking to a TV camera. You're talking to specific people who are watching TV at the other end of it. Yeah. Who are they, and what do they need to hear you saying? So job one is know the message and have that internalized. Have a clear sense of what is the North Star here. What's the path that I need to be on, and that really sets the guardrails for a spokesperson, even if that's the only sort of brief they have going in. If they know what it is they need to get across, not what the script is or what the lines are. We don't work that way, right? It's what's the message? What's the important information that you need to articulate in a way that it's going to resonate with the audience that needs to hear that, and gives them the information or the reassurance or whatever it is that they need. And also, if you once you have that sense, once you know what the path is, then by extension, you also know uh, what questions are trying to pull you off of that and try and take you in a different direction from the one that you need to be heading in. And that is the taffy pull with media, particularly in contentious situations, right? They want to knock people off their speaking points. They want to knock people off message, so that they can be satisfied that the message that they're being given is in fact the truth and is in fact the facts of the matter.
Yeah, people, reporters aren't necessarily, some, different people come at it from different points of view. But I love that idea that they're not tricking you to trick you. They're trying to understand whether or not you know what you're talking about, and whether or not it holds water when put up
Yeah,
against what the perception is of this bad thing that's going on, right? Like,
yeah, they're testing you. They're testing you to verify that what you're telling them is the real deal, and not just a talk track that somebody's put into their brain, right? What really is going on here? What really are the facts of the matter? What is the authentic information that people need to know? Because it's their job to carry that to people. So, you've got to satisfy them that you're giving them the straight goods, that they're being given the straight goods, so that they can credibly then turn around and report that to their audiences. And in good reporting, you'll hear references to, when challenged on what they were putting forward, they responded by, again confirming and reiterating and demonstrating, offering proof, demonstrating that what they were saying is the real deal.
I could go on for hours with you, Bob. Great perspectives on what we're talking about here, and great insights for people who are listening along. And I really, really appreciate it. And I'd love to have you back as this cast, should it go on for any length of time, as the series progresses.
That's it. That's it.
Try to stick to the positives here.
Stay on message, Keith.
Exactly, get the right message out there. But really, really appreciate your time, Bob. Just one more quick one, maybe. And
Sure.
we talk a lot about this, the ever evolving, the ever changing landscape of media and media relations. What kinds of trends are you seeing out there? Are there things that are popping up now more than they have in the past? Are there things that people who are in this kind of line of work need to be looking out for, or they just need to be doubling down on being prepared and expecting the unexpected?
Well, what I see is a continuation of what we've all seen for quite a number of years now, sadly, and that's the continued erosion of traditional mainstream media, the relentless downsizing of media organizations and newsrooms, and I think that's a detriment to society overall, because an effective, intelligent, informed, and journalistically responsible media is one of the foundations of our society. Not to say that we're all going to hell in a handbasket because the newspapers aren't as big as they used to be, but we've seen the damage that the fake news echo chambers can generate and perpetuate, and the negative effects that can have. So I'm dismayed by the decline of traditional, respected, high journalistic standard media. Um, I don't bemoan the rise of alternatives and specialty new media, be they popular blog sites that are go-tos for people, be they bloggers and online commentators. There's some very, very good stuff out there. But while there are, I've lost my train. We'll fix this in post.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are, I'll let you carry on if you want. Yep.
I'll just reset on that.
Yep.
So I'm troubled by the demise of the traditional mainstream media. There are some bright spots in terms of the alternatives and new media sites. There's tremendous specialization out there, and it's really quite insightful for me, for some of the clients that I work on, that in their sector, the most important media audiences are those specialty websites that follow their business and do a really good job in reporting on a highly specialized basis to a highly engaged audience that really cares about their business. That's actually a quite positive development in a lot of ways as well. So I'm getting used to the changes and how dramatically different it is from when you and I started our education and our careers in journalism. And I'm hopeful that it will ultimately shake out to a point where people do go back to, and I think it's happening already. I think we've hit the bottom and are coming back up in terms of people starting to be a lot more careful than they've been in more recent times in questioning sources of things that they see, online and in their social media feeds. Oh, I saw a story that said this. Did you see that? Yeah, I did. Did you check the source? Did you see where that story originated? Was there any credibility to it? More and more people are taking that very important step. We didn't used to have to do it because, in the olden days, the only media that we were able to receive from were highly credible by nature because they just didn't exist otherwise and couldn't exist otherwise.
Right.
So we didn't have to do it before. We all have, I think, a collective responsibility before we go sharing, reposting, forwarding, even talking to our friends about this latest, I can't believe this, this is amazing, this is terrible, this is whatever, groundbreaking that I saw online somewhere. We all have an obligation to verify the sources and just to make sure that we're dealing with credible information.
Yeah, love that perspective. And I think we both would agree, having long since left the media microphones on our side to come the other side. It's really difficult to be successful with media relations without respecting those on the other side of the table. I feel like that's a necessary place where you've got to arrive, especially in serious issues or stories where there's a lot of context, a lot of understanding that has to go on, dealing with stories that require research, that require understanding of greater themes. I always find that you have to at least look for the credibility in those who are covering you and try to build on that, and the professionalism that can exist between those who do the connection between organizations and the media or other voices. You need to be professional in what you do, and more often than not, that brings out the professionalism in those that you're dealing with. So
absolutely do. You've just encapsulated the key value of effective media relations and good media relations. Yeah. And it starts with mutual respect and being able to work together and understanding that both sides of the equation, both parties, they have a job to do, and they're professional in the work that they do and in the way they approach their work.
Bob, thanks so much for taking the time to share your views and your commentary and your insights on media relations and crisis communication. Love to have you back on the show. There's so many other topics that I'd love to delve into with you. Not the least of which would be network television in the States and what that's meant for the president there, but how the president has spawned so many questions and so many you know, so much rethinking of what media is and how it affects people and so on. And anyhow, any number of other topics. Would love to get you back on the program when we get the chance. But thank you so very much for taking the time to be on this particular episode. And again, we look forward to talking to you again at some point in the future.
It's been great, Keith. I've really enjoyed the conversation myself. Thank you.
All right. Bob Reid from Veritas Communications in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. We will definitely check back with Bob on a future episode. But we thank you for listening in on this particular episode of Speaking of Media. And blah, 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 blah. I will put an extra in.
Sure.
All right.
I will stop recording.
I'm going to check and see if there's everything here.